here. It was a wild, wild time, and we're supposed to be wowed by how extravagant this party is for Xerxes. And to tack onto that, Queen Vashti, she throws a 7-day banquet just to honor the king at the end of this 180 days. She's like, 180 wasn't enough. We need 7 more days of this nonsense. And by the end of that, the note is King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine. That's chapter 1, verse 10. High in spirits from wine is a very kind way of saying it. You can tell from the way that these things unfold in the following verses that he's 3 sheets to the wind. He's out there. And in this drunken state, he says, hey, you know what? I haven't seen my wife in a little bit. Let Queen Vashti be brought in here. Let her come into the room. Let her come into the room. And she, you can imagine, this detail isn't in there, but I'm sure there is a royal, eye roll that goes along here because she refuses. She's like, oh, he's just completely gone at this point. And so she refuses to come to the order of the king. And you can imagine Xerxes' calm, measured response to this. Not so much. The king became furious and he burned with anger. And in his drunken state, he gets his legal advisors around him and goes, hey, what do I do if the queen does not obey me? What can we do? And according to the law, if the queen does not go along with the law of the king, just like any other character, just like any other person, there are strict punishments. There are strict punishments, and Xerxes decides to dispose of Queen Vashti. She's deposed. She is removed from her position. I'm not sure how this worked out, marriage-wise, because they were technically married. I don't know how this worked out, but they were still together. But she was no longer the king, no longer the queen. All because of one, drunken episode. Probably not just one, but many. Vashti is deposed, no longer a queen. So no longer does Persia have a queen. So a search party is developed, and a number of women are brought into the king's court. And here we get introduced to Esther, who catches the king's eye. We don't get many details about Esther other than her relationship relationship to Mordecai. And then we just get the detail that she was extremely attractive to King Xerxes. And he was like, whatever we need to do for this woman, let's make her queen. I want to have her around. And so Esther, this Jewish woman, also from the tribe of Benjamin, is all of a sudden queen of this foreign land. And you go, isn't that a curious thing? And before chapter 2 ends, one more curious thing happens. Mordecai is just sitting outside the king's gate one day. And it's important to note that Esther had kept her nationality a secret. Nobody knew that she was Jewish except Mordecai and the fellow Jews at the time. She continued to follow all of Mordecai's, all of his instructions. And so he would sit outside the king's gate, and she would go out, and they would actually get to talk with one another. But one of these days that Mordecai is at the king's gate, chapter 2, verse 21, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. She's like, hey, this guy Mordecai just found out that 2 guys are trying to kill you. And she goes and reports it and makes sure that Mordecai is the one who gets the credit for it. And that's an important detail to keep in the back of our minds. When the report was investigated and found to be true, the true officials were impaled upon poles, which, spoiler alert, is a common theme in this whole story, people being impaled upon poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So a very kind of like odd little note here. Mordecai finds out about a plot to kill the king, and that ends up saving the king's life. The king knows that it was Mordecai, but doesn't actually do anything about it. The beginning of chapter 3, we get introduced to the antagonist, to Haman, who is a rather vile man, but Xerxes, being the derp that he is, doesn't really know or care or really get involved at all. But Haman is given this high and lofty position, and the king actually orders that everybody bow down to him. And there's one person who won't do it, and that is Mordecai. Mordecai says, I'm not going to bow down to that person. And with God not being mentioned at all in this story, the details about why he doesn't bow down are left ambiguous. They're unclear. Maybe it's because Mordecai wants to honor the one true rightful king. Or maybe it's because he knows that he's in a foreign land and like God is the only one that they bow down to. I'm not going to bow down to any other person than God and God's anointed. It's unclear, but Mordecai, at any rate, does not. He refuses to bow down to Haman. This, similar to Xerxes' response to Vashti, makes Haman very, very, very angry. When Haman saw that Mordecai, this is verse 5 in chapter 3, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And then we get one extra little detail here in verse 7, and this is important. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the poor, Hebrew word poor for a lot or a dice, a poor was cast in the presence of Haman to select the day and the month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So Adar is going to be the month, the 13th day of that month. It's going to be the time that all the Jews are killed. And the rest of the chapter here in chapter 3 is Haman's decree to all of the people. 12th month, we're going to take out all of the Jews. They're going to be eradicated once and for all. So there's this personal beef between Haman and Mordecai, and Haman responds by wanting to kill everybody associated with Mordecai. Not just a personal beef. It's a inter-nation issue. Brings us to chapter 4, because when Mordecai learns of the decree, he goes and he mourns and he weeps, and he knows that this is the end. This very well could be the end for him and for his people. Remember, you have this little group of Israelites living in a foreign land. He's like, if we get wiped out, like that's just one more group of us that is no longer. This is that much closer to us being wiped out as a whole people. He's distraught. And so he sends word to Esther and says, hey, this is your chance. You stand up for your people. Her nationality is not has not been disclosed yet, so nobody knows in the royal palace that she's actually connected to this decree. If somebody finds out, she could be the one that's killed. Not only that, if she were to go and talk to the king about changing this order, she would die, because the order is, the law was, nobody comes to the king, nobody approaches the king without being invited first. She cannot just walk into the king's palace, even as queen. She can't walk into the king's palace with an instruction. She can't do it. And because of this, she is reluctant to follow Mordecai's urging to go talk to the king. And here we come to really the crux of the book. Esther 4, starting in verse 12, going through verse 16. Some of the most compelling and heartfelt and riveting verses in the whole Old Testament, especially in this book. Esther 4, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Do you hear the faith element in Mordecai's response? If you don't do this, help is going to come from somewhere else. God's not mentioned in the story, but you can tell Mordecai knows God is going to come through one way or another, no matter what. God is going to come through. If you don't do this, relief and deliverance will arise from another place, but you and your father's family, you will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position, quote, for such a time as this. And this is the little phrase that gets associated with this book, for such a time as this. And it can get removed from its context and sort of sentimentalized in so many different ways. I want us to see here, this is happening in a very real life situation. And Mordecai looks at Esther and says, think about who you are and the position that you are in right now. Do you not think that God is the one who put you there? Do you not think that it is your responsibility to go talk to the king, to maybe even take your life into your own hands for the sake of your people? And Esther's response is remarkable. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Again, God is not mentioned, but these practices of prayer are still there. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther resolves to go talk to the king, and she knows it may claim her life. She may die because of standing up for her people. But she's got Mordecai and all of their people praying and fasting, and she and her attendants are going to pray and fast. I love that she takes 3 days for this, the most pressing moment of her life, and she says, let's pray for 3 days before we move forward. There's a lesson there for all of us. Which brings us to chapter 5. Esther is lingering outside the king's court, and the king sees her out of the corner of his eyes and says, hey, bring her in. I haven't seen her in a little while. We need to chat. We need to talk. And she comes to the king with a petition, and she's clearly scared. You can imagine her trembling as she comes to the king. And he's like, hey, anything that you want. I'd give you half the kingdom. Whatever you want. Remember, this is Xerxes, who's just like, yeah, whatever works on any given day. But she still feels the weight of the moment. And all she can bear to do is say, let me throw you a banquet. Let me throw you a really nice dinner. Actually, invite Haman as well. I'll throw you guys a really nice banquet. And so they all come. And at the dinner, King Xerxes looks at Esther and goes, okay, you got us here to the dinner. What is your request? What's your petition? And here's what she can say. Verse 7, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question. He's like, you know what? This dinner is really nice. Let's do another one tomorrow. And so we're left waiting. Like, okay. Haman, leaving the dinner in good spirits himself, goes waltzing out into the streets and is having himself a merry night until he sees Mordecai. Mordecai is just still sitting there at the king's gate, and Haman goes, God, I hate that guy so much. I hate that guy so much. If only I could just get rid of him. And so Haman gets home, and all his friends and family are around, and he's telling them about his wonderful day and about how rich he is and how he got to go to this banquet that was only him and the king, hosted by the queen. What a wonderful day it was. And then he says, I can't enjoy any of it because Mordecai is still sitting there on the sidewalk. He's still there. And he's just mad out of his mind. Like, talking about a powerful person who could have done anything to just dispose of this person. Like power dynamics, he could have easily wiped Mordecai off the face of the earth and nothing would have happened. But he doesn't. He restrains himself. But as he's venting to his family, his wife eventually goes, okay, let's just do something about this. Verse 14 of chapter 5, his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, well, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits. That's about 75 feet tall. That's a very, very tall pole, by the way. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. Then you can have a nice banquet tomorrow night once you see Mordecai impaled on this. Not nice, not a nice story, right? The final line of chapter 5. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. He couldn't even think clearly enough to come up with such a basic plan himself. He was too mad to do so. But his wife says, "Hey, let's just impale the guy." He's like, "Oh, that would be wonderful." So there's this crazy, massive, tall pole set up right outside of Haman's residence, and the next day, Mordecai, his foe, is going to get impaled on it. And finally, Haman can have a nice day. So nothing's going particularly well for the people of God so far in this story. Everything hinges and starts to shift in chapter 6. And this story is so dripping with irony that I have to read a good portion of it. The story shifts in one restless night, one sleepless night. Have you ever had difficulty falling asleep? Yeah. What are some of the things that you have done to try to fall asleep at night? Has a history book ever been part of it? Because that is King Xerxes' method. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be brought to him and read to him. He can't go to sleep, so he's like, you know what would do it is a history book. If somebody just reads a history book to me, that will certainly put me out. And of course, it's just him hearing about details of his own life, actually. And he's like, well, this will be pleasant. I love myself, and I love details about me. So I will fall asleep quickly, and I'll be in a good mood about it. But as the story is being written, it's found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. And Xerxes goes, hold up. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. You kind of would have been the one to do that, and you did not do that. And the king goes, okay, well, who's my nearest attendant? Who's in the court? Who's around? And guess who is the nearest attendant but Haman, our antagonist. Haman had just entered the court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he had set up for him. The tension is thick. His attendants answered, Haman's standing outside in the court. Bring him on in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And Haman thinks, king wants to do something for me. Isn't this nice? Maybe I should come up with an elaborate answer here. Haman thought to himself, who is this that the king would rather honor than me? So he says, for the man that the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. And then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on his horse through the whole city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man that the king delights to honor. Haman, you just imagine the big dumb grin on Haman's face at the end of this. Like, that's what you should do for the person that you honor. And imagine the way that the color drains from his face. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai. For Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not to neglect anything that you have recommended. You kind of blabbered on for a long time with your answer. Make sure we do all of that stuff for Mordecai. So Haman got the robe and the horse, and he robed Mordecai and led him on a horse back through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what's done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. He's a faithful man. He just goes right back to where he was. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. He told his wife everything that happened, and she said, well, this is the beginning of the end for you. And boy, was she right. The whole story shifts in this chapter 6. In chapter 7, we start to see some of the parallel nature of the story begin to play out. Remember, there was a second banquet that Esther had promised. And here it comes, chapter 7. The king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, hear how deferential she is. She is still quaking in her boots in this moment, so scared of what might happen. Because still, her Jewish identity has not been revealed in this story. If I found favor with you, your majesty, and it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. Also, spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I wouldn't have said anything. But we have been sold to be annihilated. She's talking about this decree from Haman. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Who is this man who has dared to do such a thing? And Esther said, an adversary and an enemy. She points across the table and says, that vile Haman. And Haman was terrified for his life because he knows what's about to happen. The king is enraged. The king takes a moment, walks out to the garden and blows off some steam. Haman begs for his life before Queen Esther. Xerxes comes back in the room and says, this will be the end of you. The king exclaimed, verse 9, Harbona, one of the attendants of the king said, there's a pole reaching a height of 50 cubits that stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Remember, we're still working on honoring this guy. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole that he had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. The pole that was supposed to make Haman's fury subside is the one that ends up being the end of him. It's very interesting. Esther's second banquet ends a little bit bloody. But this is only part of the issue. The main antagonist is out of the way, but his decree is still there. The 12th month is going to roll around, and all the Jews are going to be blotted out, wiped off the face of the earth, at least in Persia. And so Esther and Mordecai, always in cahoots together, they come up with a plan. And they go and they tell the king, okay, this decree is in order. And the king says, I actually can't do anything about that. I can't revoke a decree. Once a decree goes out with the seal of the king, nothing can be done about it. And this shows you just how haphazard that this king actually is. A poor leader indeed. Sending out sealed decrees this way and that way, going, we'll see what happens. Doesn't really affect me. And Esther and Mordecai go, that cannot be the end of the story. What do we do? And the Xerxes is like, well, we could do a new decree that says don't do that one. And that's exactly what ends up happening. So Mordecai ends up sending out a decree that says the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. It's not undoing Haman's decree. There's going to be a battle of sorts, but now the Jews get to defend themselves. They get to take up arms. And when they do so, they are given victory over their enemies. At the end of chapter 8, we get this note about Mordecai. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. Mordecai has effectively replaced Haman in this story. Haman, who was lifted up to the right-hand man, is now replaced with Mordecai. This lowly Jew from the tribe of Benjamin is now wearing royal robes in the land of Persia. It is a wild reversal. And you begin to see here, as these things stack up, just how intentional the author of Esther was to stack these things up in parallel. One thing reverses another. One thing parallels another. It's a wonderfully chiastic story and structure all the way along here, with chapter 6 being the hinge point that changes everything. And the story ends in chapters 9 and 10. The nation of Israel, the people of Israel, they're saved, and they're able to be delivered from all the people who are trying to blot them out. They have great success, and that actually all 10 of Haman's sons are killed, and each of them is impaled on that same pole that he had set up for Mordecai. A gruesome detail, but at least a parallel one. It's nice literarily. It's at the end of this time that they defend themselves and they are finally able to experience some degree of safety and security, that they host their own festival. And that little detail from the very beginning of Haman's story, where he issues a decree. Remember, he rolls a dice, a pur. He rolls a dice to see, hey, what month should we do this? Wiping out all the Jews. And they call their festival in celebration of being delivered from such violence Purim, which is just the plural word for dice, the Hebrew plural word for dice. They take Haman, who was going to embarrass them, and they take his act of aggression and violence towards them, and they turn it into almost a joke. And they label this feast Purim. And the book of Esther is here to explain how this feast came about, how these people, one, were treated, how they survived at the hand of God, who is not actually mentioned in the story, and where the festival of the feast of Purim came from. That's really the whole purpose of the book, but I think we can see there's so much going on beneath the surface. And chapter 10 is short and sweet and just notes how marvelous Mordecai is. This stand-up guy who God uses to essentially save the people through Queen Esther. a wild story, right? Not typically, I mean, maybe a little bit bloodier than your typical like morning devotion time is. It's a little bit wild. It's even a little bizarre with God not being mentioned or anything like that. But I think as we view it through the lens of faith, like, it's pretty clear where God was at work in this season. I think the author, who is anonymous, by the way, I think the author not including God specifically in the story, it's sort of an invitation to like look even closer into the details to see where God may actually be at work. But there's this other element of it as well, where this is a Jewish people who have more or less assimilated into this Persian culture. They have their own distinct practices as well. But Mordecai and Esther are not held up as moral paragons. They're not held up as these wonderfully like ethical individuals or whatnot. Instead, they're just like the Persians themselves. They're engaged in all the same parties and the banquets and all of that stuff. They're playing the part, and in that way, they look pretty morally compromised compared to, I don't know, say Leviticus, the way that they're supposed to be living. And so the point of this book isn't to go, wow, how wonderfully moral Esther and Mordecai are, and that's why God used them. No, the point is God works in messy situations with messy people. He doesn't need Susa to look different than it looks to be at work. He doesn't need Esther and Mordecai to be a little bit more Leviticus-y for him to work. It's a godless place, and they're still holding on to some semblance of faith. I think it leaves us with two really important takeaways. The first one is this: God stays faithful to his promises, even with this morally compromised people who are not even in the land that he gave them. The faithfulness of God is what carries along this story, not anything else. I think this is important for us. God doesn't need the situation to be different. We looked at this last week. How often do we just wait around for the perfect circumstance to say, now I can take that next step of obedience. Now faithfulness can take root in my life. How often do we just wait around for something to be better, to fall into place for us the way that we think that it should? Ezra and Nehemiah says you don't have to wait in order to take a faithful step today. And here we see God doesn't need a different place in order to be faithful to his promises. Do you think that Eugene needs to look different for God to be at work here? Are you uncomfortable with the way that this place is sometimes? You think maybe life of faith would be easier in some other context? Nothing has to change about the place for God to be faithful in the way that God is faithful. It may not look the way that we want it to. May not look the way that we expect it to. It may not be neat and tidy. All of the moral ducks may not be in a perfect row for God to work. Does the place you're living have to look different for you to be able to see God at work there? I sure hope not. Esther challenges this. And this is why I said what I did at the beginning. This is why we look at a story like this, which we could easily gloss over and carry on our own like prejudiced way. It's so ironic to me, as I was spending time with Esther this week, it's so ironic to me how often the Old Testament is used as an exclusionary tool in our lives, especially around the areas of morality. When you have a story like this, where God goes into a situation where we would not expect God to be, and God does his own delivering work exactly there. We got to stop thinking the circumstance has to be different. We got to stop wishing we were somewhere else. God wants to work in the exact place that we are. And so we might be tempted to say, well, if God's just going to work, then why do I have to do anything? Well, can I just throw my hands up? If God's got this, then what's my role? I don't have to do anything. And Esther also counters that, because it reminds us that God still ordains such a time as this type moments in context where it is difficult to see any good. Now, I'm not saying that God's going to make you queen of the nation, but he is going to put you in places that only you can be. We are celebrating today Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, where we remember that the Holy Spirit has come and infiltrated our lives. That same Spirit empowers us in our own context to be the grace and the goodness and the mercy and the peace and the hope of God wherever we are. It does not have to be a pretty situation. Not everything around us is going to fall into place all the time. But we are still, each season of our lives, going to be presented with opportunities. And God grants us the grace to have a Mordecai in our lives to come in and say, hey, you need to wake up. Because God has put you here for such a time as this. God has put you right here, right now, to do the very thing that he has called you to do. Don't sleep on it, saints. Don't sleep on the thing that God is calling you to do right now. God is going to providentially show up. He's going to be faithful no matter what. And he wants to use you in the process. If you back out, like the way Esther wanted to, we have to remember Mordecai's words. God's going to figure it out one way or another. He's going to do it. He's going to figure it out one way or another. The beauty of this whole journey of faith, this whole messy, convoluted, complex journey of faith is that he wants to use us in the midst of the mess. He doesn't need us to be somewhere else. He doesn't need us to be someone else. He's always transforming. He's always working within us. He's always doing something to make us a little more ourselves, a little more into the image that he has made us into, which is his own. He's always doing that work. But he's not sitting around to wait for the work to be complete to use us. So the question before us is this. I think we have to, if there are two big takeaways, I think we have to ask the question in two ways as well. First of all, how am I letting circumstances get in the way of seeing God's faithfulness? If I look at the world around me or the immediate context around me, am I letting those circumstances tell the primary story about my view of the world? Or am I, as a person of faith, saying, God, even though I can't see him right now, God is working. God is doing something. Am I letting circumstances get in the way of seeing God at work? The life of faith, brothers and sisters, is continually moving a little bit each day to be able to see God at work in the most impossible of places and impossible of ways. He's at work everywhere. But if we let the stories around us, if we let news cycles or the internet ultimately shape our view of the world, which is the thing that we are most in danger of right now, if we let those things primarily color the way that we see the world, we are slowly but surely going to remove God from the equation. The story of Esther forces us to ask, how am I letting my circumstances get in the way of seeing God at work? God doesn't get named in the book of Esther, but he is everywhere. Have we stopped believing it? Do our lives look like we have stopped believing it? And the second question is this: how am I letting circumstances get in the way of taking ownership of the place God has put me in this season? Maybe it's hard to see right now. Maybe the calling is obscured. But is that because the calling isn't there, or because the perspective has shifted to a place of not being able to see it anymore? God doesn't need your surroundings to be different. He wants to use you in the exact space that you are.
Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope the sermon inspired you in one way or another. If you'd like to stay connected with us, feel free to hit the Contact Us button on our website. Let us know who you are and send us any questions or prayer requests you may have. Or visit us in person at Prairie Mountain School in Eugene, Oregon at 10 a.m. on Sundays. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to stay updated on all things Westside. We'll see you next time.